Who's Yanny?
We tortured some folks.
Nazi Germany.
Now, the challenge for us as the federal government is that we don't run these police forces. I can't federalize every police force in the country and force them to retrain. But what I can do is to start working with them collaboratively so that they can begin this process of change themselves.
Just as I promised, we are allowing our local police to access surplus military equipment, something the previous administration, for some reason, refused to do. Explain that one. Explain it to me, please. Never understood that one. Somebody out there can explain. Anybody want to stand up and explain it? It'd be tough.
Who's Yanny?
Nazi Germany.
But I wanted you to bring this home for American viewers, Rania, because when we talk about what's going on in Israel, we often hear about American taxpayer dollars going to fund about $3 billion annually the U.S. gives Israel solely for military purposes. But less is known about the relationship between actually American police departments in Israel. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so almost every single American police department across this country has sent senior commanders to train in Israel since 9/11 under the cover of counterterrorism training. So they're learning tactics that Israel's using to suppress and dominate Palestinians, and they're taking those tactics and bringing them back here. And it's scandalous, and it's kind of shocking that nobody pays attention to that. But just last month, in September, several police departments went on an ADL organized trip to Israel before this escalation began. And since then, since that trip they took, I mean, Israeli soldiers and police have shot dead over 30, almost 40 Palestinians. So, I mean, you can imagine how concerning it should be that our security forces here are learning from a regime that's engaged in serious violations of human rights and war crimes on a daily basis.
There's no end in sight to the violent standoff between Palestinian protesters and the Israeli police and army as clashes spread today. The RT crew that's been filming in Ramallah today was also caught up in the conflict, all part of what's being declared a day of rage. As the violence continues and tensions escalate, more people are living in fear as they go about their daily business. RT's Paula Sleer is on the ground.
Ron, in one of the speeches you gave, you said, quote, if you don't care about Palestinians, you guys should know you're next in line, of course, referring to us here in America. Why are we next, Iran? We have about a minute left.
Israel, we need to understand that the people that benefiting from something like the massacre in the summer is Israel, but it's also the U.S. military-industrial complex, the U.S. arms trade. Israel is number 4 in the world. The U.S. is number 1 and number 2 rotating in arms trade. We need to understand that Michael Brown is Salam Shamalia. We need to understand that they're the same person. People of color in this state are the Palestinians. People of color in this state are already the next in line, but everybody else are next in line. The United States is making sure that everything that happened this summer will be silenced. If I was a United States civilian and citizens, and I urge you guys on the TV and people at home right now to go to your email account, go to your...
How would you respond to the charge that anti-Zionism is the new anti-Semitism?
Actually, the locus classicus, the best formulation of this, was by an ambassador to the United Nations, Abba Eban, Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, in an article that he wrote about 45 years ago, which I urge you to read, which appeared in an American Jewish journal, Congress Weekly, a major journal of the more liberal wing of the American Jewish community. He wrote an interesting article in which he was then UN ambassador from the State of Israel. He advised the American Jewish community that they had 2 tasks to perform. One task was to show that criticism of the policy, what he called anti-Zionism, that means actually criticisms of the policy of the State of Israel, were anti-Semitism. That's the first task. Second task, if the criticism was made by Jews, their task was to show that it's neurotic self-hatred, needs psychiatric treatment. And he gave two examples of the latter category. One was I.F. Stone, the other was me. So we have to be treated for our psychiatric disorders, and non-Jews have to be condemned for anti-Semitism if they're critical of the state of Israel. It's understandable why Israeli propaganda would take this position. I don't particularly blame Abba Eban for doing what ambassadors are sometimes supposed to do, but we ought to understand it. There is no sensible charge. No sensible charge. There's nothing to respond to. It's not a form of anti-Semitism. It's simply criticism of the criminal actions of a state. Period.
Well, as we